My name is Vivian Calloway and I'm 41 years old. For 16 years, my family believed I did contract work for a title company somewhere in the city. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 days after my father's funeral, my mother sat me down at the same kitchen table where I ate cereal as a child and told me to say I had never seen the real will. My father had left the house. The business and everything in it split 3 ways, evenly, between me, my sister Renata, and my brother Preston. That was the will he signed. That was the will I had watched him sign on a video call, on a Tuesday morning 11 months before he died, because I happened to be the one who set the whole thing up for him. The will that got filed with the court was not that will. My sister had a real estate closing scheduled on the house for 6 weeks out. My brother had already told his business partner he'd be buying him out with his third of the inheritance. And my mother had a version of events already assembled, the way she assembles everything, warm and reasonable and completely rewritten. She looked at me across that table with more tenderness than she'd shown me in over a decade, and she said, "Just say you never saw the real one, sweetheart. It'll be so much easier for everyone." What none of them knew about my job, about what that digital signature had actually recorded, about the notary who remembered exactly what she'd witnessed, took this family apart, piece by piece, over the next 9 weeks. Welcome back to my channel, where quiet people finally tell the stories their families spent years making sure nobody heard. If you've ever been the one your family assumed had nothing to lose, stay with me. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I drove 3 hours to Ashwood because my father was dead and somebody had to sign for the flowers. That's not really why. I drove 3 hours because for the first time in 16 years, my presence in that house had a legal function. And my family understood legal functions the way other families understand blood. The house looked exactly the way it always did, which is its own kind of insult. Cream shutters my father repainted every 3 years whether they needed it or not. A wreath on the door that my mother had ordered from the same florist since I was in elementary school. Inside, in the front hall, there's a narrow console table, and on it sits a ceramic dish my mother calls the landing pad. Every set of keys goes in that dish the moment you walk through the door. She started that when I was 9. She called it tidiness. It was actually a leash. I put my keys in the dish like everyone else. In the front hall, there's also a wall of photographs going up the staircase, my mother's version of a family tree. I'm in about a third of them. The most recent one of me is from a law school graduation that happened 16 years ago. After that, the wall keeps going without me. Renata's wedding, Preston's kids, a cruise, a 40th birthday party I wasn't told about until I saw the pictures online. Nobody sat down and decided to take me off the wall. That's the part people never understand about families like mine. Nobody votes you out. You just stop getting photographed, and eventually that becomes the whole story. My father found me in the kitchen before the funeral, which is a strange sentence to write, because by then he'd already been gone 4 days. And what I mean is, I found the version of him that still lived in that room. His reading glasses folded on the windowsill where he always left them. His handwriting on a grocery list stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. I stood there for a long minute holding a mug he used to drink his coffee from, and I understood, the way you understand things only after they've already happened, that I had spent 16 years keeping this family at arm's length specifically, so a moment like this wouldn't be able to reach me. It reached me anyway. At the funeral itself, my mother introduced me to a woman from her book club as our middle one. She does something with paperwork downtown. The woman nodded politely. I shook her hand and let it stand, because I always let it stand. Being vague about myself was the one skill this family ever let me practice, and I had gotten very, very good at it. By the time the guests thinned out to just family, it was nearly 9. Renata was still working the room the way she works every room, moving from cluster to cluster with a glass of white wine she never quite finished, touching people's forearms, saying the right thing in the right voice. She has a gift for grief performed correctly, sad enough to be sincere, composed enough to be reassuring to everyone around her. Preston stood by the drinks table talking business with our uncle, using our father's death as a natural segue into a real estate opportunity he'd heard about. Nobody stopped him. Nobody ever stops Preston. I said goodnight and went up to my old room, which isn't my room anymore. It's storage now, a treadmill nobody uses, boxes of Christmas decorations, a sewing machine still in its case. My childhood bed had been replaced by a daybed for guests who never come, because I'm the only one who visits, and I hadn't visited in 3 years. I lay there in the dark and thought about nothing in particular, the way you do when you're too tired to think about the thing that actually matters. And then somewhere around 11, I heard voices downstairs. My mother's voice, low, and a man's voice I didn't immediately recognize. Not arguing, arranging. That specific tone people use when they're dividing something up and trying to sound reasonable about it. I should have gone down. I told myself I was too tired. That was the first small lie I told myself in this story, and it would not be the last. The reading of the will happened 4 days later, in a conference room above a strip mall that also housed a nail salon and a mattress store. I remember that detail specifically because I kept thinking, the whole time, that my father, a man who wore a full suit to open a bank account, would have hated dying into a room that smelled faintly of acetone. The lawyer at the head of the table was not my father's longtime attorney, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Pell, who had handled our family's affairs since before I was born. It was someone new, younger, a woman named Kristen Boyle, who introduced herself as having recently taken over the file, and who had a folder in front of her that looked freshly printed, the paper still crisp at the corners in a way that 11-month-old documents never are. She read through it efficiently. The house to Renata. The business. My father's hardware distribution company. 31 years of his life. To Preston. To me, a specific bequest, his wristwatch and $10,000. I did not say anything in that room. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. I sat very still and did the thing I have spent an entire career training myself to do, which is notice everything and reveal nothing. Here is what I noticed. The document had my father's signature on it, but the notarization block referenced an in-person signing in this same conference room, on a date 8 months after the video call I personally set up for him, the one where he signed a will electronically through a platform I use with my own clients every week. A platform that certifies identity through ID verification, records a time-stamped video of the signer, and generates an audit trail that cannot be edited after the fact without leaving a digital fingerprint. My father had been recovering from hip surgery on the date this new will claimed he'd walked into an office and signed something in person. He hadn't left his house in 6 weeks. I sat in that room with a folder of paper that told a story that could not physically have happened, surrounded by a family already dividing up the furniture in their heads, and I said, "Thank you, that's very clear," and I put my copy in my bag. Renata already had a real estate agent's card sitting next to her purse. She must have called someone before the funeral flowers had even wilted. 2 days later, my mother called and asked me to come by, just to talk, nothing formal. I knew what nothing formal meant in this family. It meant everyone would be there and a decision would already be made before I sat down. I was right. Preston was at the kitchen table when I walked in, along with a man I didn't recognize, a lawyer. It turned out a colleague of Kristen Boyle's, there in what he called an advisory capacity. My mother had made coffee. Renata arrived 12 minutes after me, in workout clothes, like she'd fit this meeting between other, more important things. They did not ask me how I was doing. Nobody asked whether I'd slept, or whether I was managing, or what I remembered about the last time I saw our father alive. They started talking, and I want you to understand exactly how they talked, because it's the whole architecture of what happened to me in that house. Nobody said, "Dad wanted this." Nobody said his name at all, not once in the entire conversation. They said the estate. They said moving this along efficiently. They said, given everyone's timelines. My mother poured more coffee. And underneath all of it, in pieces, I watched the actual shape of what they wanted assemble itself in front of me like furniture coming out of flat pack boxes. They wanted me to sign an affidavit, a short, simple document, the lawyer explained, confirming that I had no knowledge of any other testamentary document beyond the one that had been filed with the court. A clean statement. Nothing dramatic. Just a formality to move probate along without complications. He slid it across the table to me, already typed, my name already at the top. I read it twice.
It said I had no personal knowledge of any prior will executed by my father.
It said I was not aware of any electronic signing platform having been used in connection with his estate planning. I had set that platform up myself. I had watched him sign on that call. I had a copy of the confirmation email in my own inbox. My mother came around the table and put both hands on my shoulders, the same way she used to when I was small and upset about something she'd decided wasn't worth being upset about. She looked at me with more warmth than I'd felt from her in years, and she said it plainly, like she was doing me a favor. "Just say you never saw the real one, sweetheart. It'll be so much easier for everyone." I asked her if she understood what she was asking me to do. She said she understood exactly, and that's precisely why it had to be me. Renata had the closing scheduled. Preston had already made commitments to his business partner. I had, and this is the phrase she actually used, the least writing on it. Preston didn't even look up from his phone. He said, "Vivian, come on. You do paperwork for a living. You know how this stuff gets messy if people start dragging out old drafts. Just sign it." I said no once, evenly. Then I said it again, because the first time didn't seem to register with anyone at that table. Renata set her water glass down and looked at me the way you look at someone who's making an inconvenient scene at a nice restaurant. She wasn't even angry. That was the part that stayed with me. She said, "Who's going to believe you, Viv? You've been gone for years. Nobody even knows what you do." I picked up my coat off the back of the chair. I got as far as the doorway, and then my mother said one more thing, and it stopped me with my hand on the frame. "The affidavit isn't really a request," she said. "Arthur's replacement has already noted in the file that all 3 beneficiaries appear to be in agreement. If you don't sign, it just makes you the outlier, and outliers get investigated first." I turned around. The lawyer wouldn't meet my eyes, which is how I knew that sentence had come from him originally. Dressed up in my mother's voice to land softer. If you've ever sat at a table with people who share your last name and realized, in real time, that they had already decided who you were going to be, stay with me. This is where it starts to turn. If this story is hitting close to home already, drop a comment and let me know. I read everyone. Subscribe if you haven't, because it's about to get a lot more interesting. I should tell you what happened when I was 26, because it's the foundation this whole house was built on. I failed the bar exam the first time I took it. It happens to a large percentage of every graduating class. It's a footnote in most people's lives. It happened to happen the same summer my father was up for re-election to the county planning board. And a man running for re-election needs a story that makes him relatable. So at a Rotary Club dinner in front of 150 people who owned car dealerships and ran the local bank, he told them his daughter had gone off to law school, with big plans, and hadn't quite gotten there yet. He said it warmly, self-deprecating even. The room laughed the good-natured laugh, and he got the humility points he needed. I was standing 3 feet away from him when he said it. Afterward, in the parking lot, I asked my mother how she could stand next to him and let him say that in front of everyone. She straightened my collar the way she does when she's about to say something she considers helpful. She said, "We don't tell the whole story in this family, honey. We tell the version that works." I passed the bar 5 months later, in the winter sitting. I never told them. I took a job at a firm 2 states away, and I built an entire career this family has no idea exists. I specialize in estate planning and probate litigation. I have spent 16 years standing next to people whose families tried to write them out of their own inheritances, and I have watched almost every single one of those cases turn on the exact same question. Who controls the paperwork first? I learned something in my first year of practice that I mistook for wisdom for the next decade and a half. If you never tell people what you actually do, they can't use it against you, and they can't ask you for anything either. So I stopped correcting the paperwork joke. I stopped sending updates. When I made partner 4 years ago, I didn't invite a single person who shared my last name because I hadn't told any of them the ceremony was happening. I told myself the silence was independence. It took a forged will and my mother's hand on my shoulder to show me what it actually was. Here's the thing about a fraudulent will. You cannot simply announce that you know. The moment you tip your hand, the paperwork starts disappearing, memories start getting rehearsed, and the version of events that gets told to a judge 6 months later is a version that's had 6 months to get comfortable. So I did not go back to that kitchen table and announce anything. I went home, and on Monday morning, I called the company that operated the signing platform my father used. I did not identify myself as family. I identified myself by the case number tied to the transaction and requested, through the proper channel, the full certified audit log, the timestamp, the IP address, the video verification, the identity check performed against his driver's license. All of it, sealed in the platform's own certification format, the kind courts accept without a fight, because it comes from an independent third party with no reason to lie for anyone. It took 4 business days. When it came back, it was exactly what I remembered. My father, sitting in his recliner with his hip brace visible in the corner of the frame, on the exact date I remembered, confirming his identity, reviewing each page, signing electronically while a camera recorded his face doing it. 11 months before his death, 8 months before the date, the filed will claimed he'd signed something new, in person, in an office he could not have physically walked into. I did not confront anyone with this yet. I want to be very clear about why, because it's the single most important decision in this entire story. I am an attorney. If I had gone straight to Renata or my mother waving this printout, I would have handed them 8 months to build a counter-narrative. Coach a story or worse, destroy something before anyone official ever looked at it. Evidence doesn't win cases by existing. It wins cases by surviving contact with the people who are afraid of it. So instead, I did something almost embarrassingly unglamorous. I hired a forensic document examiner. Her name is Denise Okafor, and I'd worked with her on 3 prior cases. I called her not as Vivian the daughter, but as Vivian the attorney referring a matter. And I asked her to independently examine the physical will that had been filed with the court, the paper stock, the ink aging, the signature stroke pressure, completely blind to my family relationship, so that her findings couldn't later be dismissed as biased. Denise came back 12 days later with a report that used words like inconsistent aging, characteristics, and signature pressure patterns suggestive of tracing. In plain language, the signature on the filed will did not match the natural variance you'd expect from a person signing their own name, and the paper had almost certainly been printed within the last several months, not 11 months prior, despite what the notarization date claimed. I sat with that report for a long time in my own kitchen, 3 states away from Ashwood, and felt something very close to grief arrive late. Because the report didn't just prove fraud. It proved, in the coldest possible language, that someone in my family had sat down, printed a document, forged my father's signature, and taken it to a notary who either didn't check carefully enough or was told a story convincing, enough not to ask. The next thing I did was the thing that cost me the most in the short term and protected me the most in the long term. I am a member of the state bar, and I hold a position on an oversight committee for a regional court system, a role that carries its own ethics obligations, separate from my private practice. The moment I realized I might become a fact witness in litigation involving my own family, I had an obligation to disclose that conflict before anyone found out on their own and used it against me. So on a Wednesday, I drove to see the ethics counsel for my firm, a precise, unhurried man named Julian Ferris, who has an office with no personal photographs in it at all. I told him everything. A member of my immediate family had likely committed fraud in connection with a probated will. I had independently obtained a certified audit trail and a forensic document report. I was likely to be called as a witness in a probate contest. I wanted to disclose it formally before proceeding any further. He asked careful questions. He wrote everything down. And then he gave me the rules, which were not the rules I was hoping for. I could not represent any party in the matter myself, obviously. That was expected. But he went further. I could not advise Preston or my mother informally, even if they asked. I could not contact the notary directly in any capacity that suggested I was acting as counsel. If I was going to be a witness, I needed to behave from that point forward, exactly like any other witness, meaning I needed my own independent attorney, someone with zero connection to my firm to guide me through it. You understand, he said, that this means you will have fewer options than an ordinary family member in this situation would have, not more. You're the one person in that family who actually has to follow the rules. I said I understood. I drove home that night with the specific, hollow feeling of realizing that the one advantage I actually had, years of legal training, had just been converted, formally and irreversibly, into a stricter set of restrictions than anyone else in this story was operating under. Word travels strangely in a family like mine. Nobody tells you anything directly. You learn what's happening by which doors start closing. The first sign was small. Renata's real estate closing, originally scheduled for 6 weeks out, got pushed. She didn't tell me this. I found out because my mother mentioned it in passing, sounding annoyed, saying something about title company delays, which is not actually a phrase that describes what happens when a probate court quietly places an administrative hold on a file pending review, which is what I suspected and later confirmed had actually happened, because a probate clerk cannot approve final distribution while a formal request for documentation is outstanding, and I had submitted exactly such a request through my own retained probate counsel. The moment Denise's report came back, I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I had simply quietly, through completely proper legal channels, asked the court to hold the file open pending verification of the will's authenticity, citing my status as an omitted beneficiary under the prior instrument. That's it. No confrontation. No dramatic reveal. Just paperwork, moving through a system that doesn't care how anyone feels about it. My mother called me the following week, her voice tight in a way I recognized from childhood, right before she'd asked me to apologize for something that wasn't my fault. She said there seemed to be some kind of holdup with the paperwork. And did I know anything about that? Since I used to be good with that sort of thing, I told her I didn't know the details of Renata's closing. This was true. I knew the details of the probate hold, which is a different thing entirely, and I let that distinction do exactly the work I intended it to do. Preston texted me directly for the first time in 8 months. Everything okay with the estate stuff? Getting weird vibes from Mom. I didn't answer for 2 days, and when I did, I wrote 3 words. Everything's proceeding normally, which was also true. It was proceeding exactly as normally as a fraud investigation proceeds. At dinner the following Sunday, I drove up for it. Because staying visible mattered more than staying comfortable, my father's old attorney's name came up. Arthur Pell, the man who had actually handled our family's affairs for 30 years before mysteriously being replaced by Kristen Boyle right around the time of my father's final months. My mother changed the subject twice. Preston asked offhand whatever happened to Arthur. My mother said he'd retired. I happened to know, because I had checked, that Arthur Pell was still practicing 3 towns over and had, in fact, never formally withdrawn from representing my father's estate. He had simply stopped being consulted. I filed that fact away and passed the green beans. Fraud, once it senses pressure, does not sit still. It reaches for whatever leverage is closest. And in my family, the closest leverage has always been guilt. 10 days after the probate hold went into effect, a letter arrived at my apartment on the letterhead of Kristen Boyle's firm. It was addressed to my newly retained probate counsel, a sharp, unbothered attorney named Renee Okoye, who I had worked opposite years earlier and trusted completely. The letter stated that the family categorically disputed any suggestion of irregularity in the will's execution, and that if I persisted in what it called an unsubstantiated challenge, the family reserved the right to pursue a claim against me for tortious interference with an inheritance, along with the cost of litigation. It was a threat wearing a suit. And buried in paragraph 4, phrased so carefully it took me 2 readings to fully understand what it was doing, the letter noted that the family's understanding is that any discrepancy in signing dates may be attributable to a preliminary draft that was later formally executed in person, a fact to which multiple family members are prepared to attest under oath if necessary. There it is. If the digital signature couldn't be explained away, they were going to argue it was just an early draft, and that everyone in the family, my mother, my siblings, would simply say under oath that Dad signed the real thing in person later. 4 witnesses against 1 digital record. That was the plan. That same week, Renee called to tell me something I hadn't expected. My independent probate filing had prompted the court to request the platform certification directly, and separately, without any involvement from me, the notary listed on the filed will had been contacted by the court clerk's office for standard verification. A routine step that happens more often than people think. The notary's name was Marla Voss. She ran a small notary and shipping office 2 towns from my parents' house. And according to Renee, when the clerk's office called to confirm the details of the in-person signing she'd notarized, Marla Voss had gone very quiet on the phone and asked if she could call back. Let me ask you something. And think about it honestly before you answer. If proving the truth meant losing every relationship you had left in your family, not a fight, not a bad holiday, but permanently, completely, would you still do it? Don't answer too fast. Put it in the comments. I'll tell you what I chose in a little while. And if you're new here, subscribe, because you are going to want to see how this ends. Marla Voss called Renee's office 3 days later, not the court. She wanted to speak to the attorney representing Mr. Calloway's daughter, and Renee, sensing exactly what this was, brought me onto the call. Carefully. On the record, with Marla's consent. Recorded with proper notice given the sensitivity of what she might be about to. Say. Marla was nervous in the specific way people are nervous, when they've done something they now regret, and have been hoping nobody would ever ask about it directly. She said that back in the winter, a woman had come into her office. She described her, and the description matched Renata down to a birthmark near her collarbone, with an older man who she was told was the client. The woman had done most of the talking. The older man had signed where he was told to sign, quietly, without saying much. Marla admitted haltingly that she hadn't checked his ID as thoroughly as she should have, because the woman seemed to know him well, seemed like family, and Marla had been slammed that day with a line out the door. I asked her, as gently as I could manage given that my hands were shaking, whether she could describe the man who signed. She described someone in his 60s, gray hair, using a cane. My father did not use a cane. My father, in the months before his death, used a walker following his hip surgery, and he was in his early 70s, with a very distinctive scar above his left eyebrow, from a childhood accident that Marla, when asked directly, did not recall seeing. Marla Voss had notarized a signature from a man who was very likely not my father at all. She agreed, shaken and clearly aware of what this meant for her own professional exposure, to provide a sworn statement to the court describing exactly what she remembered. Renee told me afterward that Marla's cooperation, offered voluntarily before any subpoena, was going to matter enormously, because a reluctant witness forced to testify is one thing, but a witness who comes forward on her own, worried and honest, is a different kind of powerful entirely. My mother came to see me alone, on a Sunday evening without calling first, which she has never once done in my entire life. She sat in my apartment, in a city she has visited exactly twice, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, and she made me an offer. She said Arthur, a version of Arthur at least, since she had apparently quietly gone back to consulting him once things started to unravel, had suggested there was still a path where this didn't have to become a public mess. A private settlement. Renata would give up the house, sell it, and split the proceeds 3 ways. Preston would keep the business but pay out my third in cash over time. No court finding of fraud, no criminal referral, no notary dragged into a hearing. Just money, quietly redistributed, and everyone's name kept clean. And then she said the part she'd actually driven 3 hours to say, and she said it softly, looking right at me the way she used to when I was small, and she wanted something from me that she knew I didn't want to give. You'd have your family back, Vivian. Really back. Christmases, the kids' birthdays, all of it. Everything you've wanted since you were 26, and you know it. And I know it. 16 years I had been standing outside the version of this family that photographs itself and calls people back and remembers birthdays. And my mother was finally opening that door, and the price on it was silence about exactly how, and by whom. My father's real wishes had been erased. I want to be honest with you about something, because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of. For about 30 seconds, sitting across from her in my own kitchen, I wanted to say yes. Not because of the money, because some very old, very tired part of me still wanted the wall of photographs to keep going with my face in it. Then I thought about the timestamp on that video signing. My father, in his recliner, hip brace visible, reviewing every page carefully because that's who he was. A careful man, wanting his children treated fairly. He hadn't signed a will that erased me. Someone had erased him too, in a much smaller but much colder way, the moment they signed his name onto a document he never saw. I told my mother no. I said it once, plainly, and I did not raise my voice. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face shifted from pleading to calculation, the way it always eventually does. She said, "You understand this means we can't protect you anymore either." I told her I hadn't asked to be protected. I'd asked for the truth to be filed with a court. Those had never been the same thing in this family, and I was done pretending they were. The probate contest was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the same county courthouse where my father had once served on the very board that gave him his Rotary Club material. It's a limestone building with a bad parking lot and a security line that moves slower than it should. Renee met me on the steps. The hearing room smelled like every institutional room I've ever sat in. Old carpet, coffee, the specific hum of fluorescent lights. My mother sat with Renata on one side, Preston beside them, Kristen Boyle at the table with a folder that no longer looked crisp at all. On the other side sat Renee, myself as a fact witness rather than counsel of record, and arriving quietly, escorted by an officer of the court. Clearly uncomfortable, but there, Marla Voss. The judge was a woman named Judge Alvarez, unhurried, precise, the kind of person who has clearly sat through 100 families destroying each other over furniture and money and called it grief. Renee entered the evidence in order. The certified digital signing platform record, time-stamped, video verified, independently authenticated by the company itself, showing my father signing the original will 11 months before his death. In his own recliner, hip brace visible in frame. Denise Okafor's forensic report on the filed paper document, describing signature inconsistencies and printing characteristics inconsistent with the claimed execution date. And finally, Marla Voss's sworn statement, read into the record in her own halting voice, describing a man she notarized who did not match my father's physical description in several specific, unmistakable ways. Kristen Boyle's cross-examination of Marla was sharp, and she tried, reasonably, to suggest memory fades, that months blur together, that a busy notary sees dozens of faces a week. Marla, to her enormous credit, did not overstate what she knew. She simply said evenly, "I know I didn't check his ID as carefully as I should have, and I know the man in my memory used a cane, and I've since learned Mr. Calloway didn't." Then it was my turn. I sat in the witness chair and told it in order, without embellishing anything. The console table and the key dish, the photo wall that stopped 16 years ago, the kitchen table conversation where I was asked to sign an affidavit stating I had no knowledge of a document I had personally helped my father execute, my mother's hands on my shoulders, Renata's line about who would believe me. I did not editorialize once. I let the facts sit in the room the way facts do when nobody's trying to dress them up. On cross, Kristen Boyle asked the question I knew was coming, the one designed to make the whole thing sound implausible to anyone watching. She asked how a family could possibly not know that their own daughter was a practicing attorney with expertise in exactly this kind of case. She asked it with real disbelief in her voice, turned slightly toward the gallery so the room would feel the absurdity of it too. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. Then I said, because I let them not know. For 16 years, it was easier to be underestimated than to be asked for anything. That's my share of how we got here, and I've finished paying it. Behind Kristen Boyle, at the respondent's table, I watched Renata start talking urgently to her own attorney. He put a hand up, telling her to wait. She didn't wait. She stood up at the table, still in the composed, camera-ready posture she's had since she was a teenager, and said the judge was only hearing one carefully constructed version of events, that I had been distant from this family for years, and had no right to insert myself into decisions I hadn't been present for. That everyone made adjustments to paperwork sometimes, and it wasn't fraud. It was just family taking care of family. The judge told her twice she'd have her opportunity to testify through counsel. On the third attempt, Renata got to the sentence she'd apparently been building toward the entire hearing, and it came out at full volume in a room, with a court reporter typing every word of it into a permanent record. She got a watch and $10,000, and she's trying to burn down everything the rest of us actually built. I have 3 kids. She has nobody. Why does she get to decide what's fair? Nobody in that room moved for a moment. My mother put a hand over her mouth. I don't know, even now, whether it was for Renata or for me. Judge Alvarez did not rule from the bench that day. She took it under advisement, which in practice meant 3 more weeks of waiting. 3 more weeks in which nobody in my family spoke to me at all, which was, honestly, the quietest and most peaceful 3 weeks I'd had with them in years. The ruling, when it came, was administrative and unglamorous in exactly the way real justice usually is. The court found the filed will invalid due to insufficient and contradicted evidence of proper execution, and ordered the estate to proceed under the terms of the prior, digitally executed instrument, the one that split everything 3 ways, evenly the way my father actually wanted it. The court further referred the matter to the State Notary Licensing Board regarding Marla Voss's conduct, and separately referred the question of who had actually forged the signing to the county prosecutor's office for review, since a probate court can settle who inherits what, but it cannot, on its own, decide who committed a crime. Renata was never criminally charged. The prosecutor's office reviewed it and determined, ultimately, that they could show the will was fraudulent, but proving beyond a reasonable doubt exactly whose hand had guided that man with the cane into Marla Voss's office, whether it was Renata herself, or someone she'd hired, or someone else in the family entirely, was a harder case than the office wanted to build against a grieving, sympathetic mother of 3. I want to be honest about how that sat with me. It sat badly for a long time. Then, slowly, it stopped, because I understood that the courtroom was never going to give me the part I actually needed. What I needed had already happened the moment Judge Alvarez said the word invalid out loud. The house was sold, as originally planned, but the proceeds were split 3 ways under court supervision, instead of 2 ways under a forged signature. The business stayed with Preston, but with a formal buyout structure that finally paid me and Renata our actual shares, verified and enforced, instead of promised and delayed. Kristen Boyle's firm quietly stopped representing the family entirely once the notary referral became public in local legal circles. Marla Voss kept her license after a formal reprimand and a mandatory retraining course, and, I later heard, tightened her ID checking procedures considerably. I want to tell you honestly what this actually cost, because a clean revenge story is a lie, and I promised myself somewhere in the middle of this that I wasn't going to tell any more convenient versions. My mother has not called me since the ruling. Preston sends a text around the holidays, brief and neutral, the kind you send someone you used to know. Renata and I have not spoken at all. I found out secondhand through a cousin that she and her husband separated about 4 months after the hearing, and I felt something complicated about that. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like watching a structure I once lived inside of finish collapsing after I'd already walked out of it. The one relationship that survived, unexpectedly, was with my niece, Renata's oldest, who's 16 now and who texted me out of nowhere last spring. Nobody will tell me what actually happened with Grandpa's will. Everyone just gets weird when I ask. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I didn't make her mother a villain, and I didn't make her innocent either. I told her, in the plainest language I could manage, exactly what happened, the same way I've told you. She wrote back, "Thank you for not lying to me too." That's the sentence I keep. Out of this whole 9 weeks. The one I actually keep. I still do the work I've always done, quietly, 3 states away, helping other people's families sort out exactly the kind of mess mine tried to bury me under. A few months ago, a new associate at my firm asked me in the break room, completely innocently, whether I had family nearby. A year earlier, I would have said no and let the question pass, the way I let everything pass for 16 years, and she would have written me off as private and been right to. Instead, I heard myself say the whole true sentence out loud. My family's a few hours from here. We're not really in touch anymore. It's because my sister forged our father's will, and my mother asked me to help cover it up, and I didn't. She didn't quite know where to put her face. I told her that was all right, that most people don't know what to say, and they don't have to. Then we went back to the filing we were working on. My mother was right about one thing, and I've decided to let her keep it. Families do run on the version of events that's easiest to live with. That part was always true. But I'm done being asked to hold the inconvenient parts for everyone else so their version stays clean. If the people who share your blood only want you around for what you'll agree to stay quiet about, that was never actually love. It was just management. And the day you stop letting yourself be managed is the day the rest of your life is finally allowed to belong to you. That's my story. 1 certified timestamp, 1 honest notary, and 1 affidavit I never signed. If there's someone in your life who's decided you're the one with nothing to lose, Hear me clearly. You do not owe anyone a smaller version of the truth. Not for the holidays. Not ever. If this one stayed with you, send it to somebody who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.